Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is looking at gas exchange in the respiratory system or strategies that different animals take. First is understanding two key terms. Respiratory medium, which is the source of oxygen. Two main sources here: air, which is about 21% oxygen, and water, which will vary. And this was one of the things that we look for in water sources to look at what kind of life they may have, would be the percent of oxygen in that source. If it's good, then you expect to see a lot of life there. If that water source has a poor oxygen supply, then that will obviously diminish the life that you find in that water source. The respiratory surface is the part of the animal where gases are exchanged, and this occurs by diffusion. This is not an active process, which is good, because the organism is able to obtain the oxygen it needs and release the carbon dioxide that it doesn't need without the use of added energy. You want to conserve as much of that energy as possible. So these will actually just diffuse from high to low concentration across a usually thin cell surface of the organism. And we'll look at a couple examples of these respiratory surfaces. All living cells must be bathed in water to maintain their plasma membranes. If they start to dry out, then those plasma membranes will start to disrupt and mess up as well. So for all of this to take place, the medium, the area that diffusion of oxygen takes place and that diffusion of carbon dioxide, that has to be a moist environment. And all living cells, as that is continued to move back and forth across cells, have to be surrounded or bathed in some kind of watery liquid to keep their plasma membrane intact and to prevent it from rupturing or messing up. Let's look at a couple strategies. The first is gills. Now, we know of gills in fish. That's the most common example. But there are gills in most water living organisms. I say most because there are some that use a different strategy other than gills. But in starfish, in crayfish, in clams, you see gills. Now, some of those organisms will just allow the water to wash over those gills, and as that water washes over whichever direction the water is moving, it will deposit some oxygen into those organisms, and that's how they'll obtain their oxygen. However, once you get into more complex organisms and organisms that really need to move around more and that sort of thing, that just flow of the water is not going to be enough to really get the oxygen you need. The other problem is if it's getting oxygen, it's also letting off carbon dioxide. Well, if that carbon dioxide in the water builds up around the gills, then the water coming through wouldn't be able to bring oxygen to those areas. So what organisms have developed is a way to do what we call ventilation, and that's moving that water in a specific direction. Now, this takes energy to do that, but the oxygen they're going to get out of that is greater than the energy that they're going to need for that process. So it's going to be an added benefit. So this increases the flow of the respiratory medium, in this case water, over the respiratory surface, in this case gills. So we see this in fish. That's the easy example. Water comes through the mouth and then is pushed across the gills and out the space here. This will be protected by a flap called an operculum, but there's a gap here in the back, and if you've ever went fishing, you know this. In fact, this is one of the ways that you can string fish, is by putting the string through their mouth and then out the gill slit operculum area. So as water is pushed through this, it's actually pushed, and you can see a little close-up version here of the gills. It's actually pushed through these gills that they kind of look like finger-like projections that sit here, and water will be pushed through those. Okay? When we go a little bit closer, what we see is oxygen-poor blood coming in here, going across a capillary bed here, and water will flow this way. So you got blood flowing this way, water flowing this way. Now what that does is that creates what we call countercurrent exchange. So water's coming in at the most oxygen in the water. We're going to say that's 100%. It's not 100% dissolved oxygen, but it's 100% of whatever this water source has. And as it's hitting those gills, you've got blood that's only about 90% oxygen. That's pretty good blood because it's near the end of that capillary bed. as water goes this way, oxygen will diffuse into the blood. So when you get over here, you've got less oxygen in the water, but you've got very poor oxygen blood coming in. So there still will be oxygen exchange here. So in this countercurrent exchange, what you have is you guarantee that the most oxygen is always being diffused into the blood. And this creates a decent way to get oxygen in the blood, and then eventually that oxygen-rich blood will go back into the organism. In insects, instead of a gill system, we actually see a tracheal system. Sorry, I was thinking about something else. A tracheal system. And in the tracheal system, you have spiracles, which are these holes in the side of the organism. A tracheal system that connects all those to air sacs throughout that insect's body. And what that does is that those branches will extend to the surface of nearly every cell, and it'll provide air for all of those cells and an exchange then of air to those cells. So in small insects, just normal air flow is going to provide enough air or oxygen to all the cells in the body. If you get into larger insects or flying insects, it needs another system. So it ventilates in different strategies. Some will, when the wings flap on the flying insects, when those wings flap, they actually will push in on those air sacs and it pushes air out. So when they pull, the wings go back up, that'll actually suck air into the insect. So that keeps a better, supply of oxygen in there. There is no need for the blood to circulate the oxygen and carbon dioxide in these, because you can see that tracheal system pretty much goes to all parts of the insect's body. So we've talked about insects in circulation. They said they have got an open circulation. They pump blood, these hemolymph, into these open areas, bathe the organs in nutrients, and then it's pumped back out. Well, that would be a very inefficient way to pump oxygen through a system. So they actually don't use their blood to circulate oxygen. They use this tracheal system to help circulate oxygen throughout their system. And then you get into the organisms that we are that use lungs. Now you have some type of diaphragm muscle down here. You've got the lungs, the trachea coming in to bronchi, and then the bronchi to bronchioles, and then the bronchioles eventually will end in these alveoli. And this is this is the best drawing I could get. For the alveoli, you've got oxygen-poor blood coming in, and it will split into these capillaries around these alveoli, which are like little ball clusters. Okay? And as those capillaries spread out, oxygen, carbon dioxide will be exchanged, and then you'll have oxygen-rich blood, the red line, going back into the body. So the flow of air will go trachea, bronchus, bronchioles, alveoli. That'll be the flow of oxygen in. Then the flow of carbon dioxide out would be alveoli, bronchioles, bronchus, trachea. This gas exchange occurs in a very thin epithelium of the lungs, millions of alveoli. We're talking about tons of these all over the place, and they have a very thin epithelial layer on the inside of them, and that allows that diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to take place rather easily. The last thing I want to look at is ventilation. And in ventilation, we've already talked about this, but that's breathing, alternating inhaling and exhaling. That's ventilating. It's forcing air in and out of the body. There's two strategies that we see in animals to do this that have lungs. The first is called positive breathing. This we see in animals like frogs. They will, in essence, gulp air. So they'll pull air into their mouth and then kind of push that air through muscle reactions. They'll actually push that air down into their lungs. Okay? So that is a gulping motion, forcing air down into the lungs. Then you have in us, we have what we call negative breathing. In negative breathing, we do a pulling motion, or kind of like a suction pump type motion, instead of pushing it. And this is the creation of our diaphragm. Okay? As the diaphragm contracts, it will expand the lungs. And that causes that inhaling of breath. It's a suction system. So as you increase the lung, it has to pull air to increase that lung. Okay? So that pulls air down in there, and then as the diaphragm relaxes, it will pull. It will kind of like contract those lungs. It's not contracting a muscle other than the diaphragm, but it allows those muscles, those lungs, to deflate or push air back out. Then it contracts, it sucks air back in, and then pushes air back out, and that's how you breathe.